Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so you've shared some really interesting sources about the whole U.S.-China economic relationship, specifically this tariff stuff that's been going on. Our mission today, really, is to dig into this tax war, as some call it, try to make sense of it all and, pull out the key things folks need to know.
Absolutely. It's been a major factor for a few years now. It really started to pick up steam around, 2018? And it's still having big impacts today.
Yeah, 2018 sounds right.
Yeah.
And like you said, the tariffs, they're the obvious part, but it feels like there's more going on underneath, right?
Exactly. You have to see it in the bigger picture. It's not just about trade disputes in isolation.
It's part of this larger, maybe geopolitical competition, technology races, that kind of thing.
Precisely. The tariffs are a tool, maybe a weapon, in that larger context.
Okay, so let's trace it back. Where did this specific round of friction actually start? What kicked it off?
Well, the official start, you could say, was with the concerns raised by the Trump administration about China's trade practices. They felt certain things were fundamentally unfair.
Unfair to American businesses, presumably.
Yes. They pointed to several specific issues that were putting U.S. companies at a disadvantage.
Okay, so what were the specifics? It wasn't just a general feeling, right?
No, they were quite clear. First, a big one was intellectual property theft. Accusations that U.S. firms had to, hand over technology to operate in China.
Forced tech transfer, they called it.
Exactly. Then there were the heavy state subsidies for Chinese companies, which obviously makes it hard for others to compete fairly.
Right. Skews the playing field.
And also selling goods below market cost to gain share. That was another accusation.
Okay. IP theft, subsidies, dumping.
Yeah.
Anything else?
And the big one, the overall trade imbalance, that massive deficit the U.S. had with China. I think in 2017, it was something like $375 billion.
Oh, $375 billion.
Yeah.
That's a number that gets attention.
Yeah.
So the U.S. used that as justification.
It was definitely a key part of the narrative. And they used a specific legal tool to act, didn't just, impose tariffs out of the blue.
Ah, right. There was a legal basis, they cited.
Correct. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, it basically gives the U.S. Trade Representative power to investigate and take action if another country's trade practices are seen as unfair or discriminatory and harm U.S. businesses.
Okay, so Section 301, that was the mechanism. So the U.S. makes its move. But it didn't stop there, did it? China obviously wasn't just going to sit back.
Oh, absolutely not. It quickly turned into a tit-for-tat situation, an escalation.
Back and forth.
Exactly. You can almost break it down into phases, how it rolled out.
Okay, yeah, maybe walking through those phases would help clarify the timeline.
Sure. So phase one, maybe. You had the initial U.S. tariffs announced in March 2018. That was the 25% on about $50 billion of Chinese goods. Things like steel, aluminum, some tech.
Right, steel and aluminum were early targets.
Then, just a few months later, July 2018, another round, 25% again, but this time on $34 billion worth of different stuff, electronics, machinery.
Okay, so adding more products.
And then the really big one hit in September 2018. Tariffs on a huge list, $200 billion worth of goods. Started at 10%, but that was later hiked up to 25% in 2019.
Wow. Okay, so that's a lot of pressure building up. How did Beijing respond to all this?
Pretty much immediately and very directly. China hit back with its own 25% tariffs on $50 billion of U.S. goods.
And what kind of goods were they targeting?
They went for things that would hurt. Key U.S. exports like soybeans, cars, pork, stuff that hits specific sectors, specific states,
Like soybeans. That sounds politically targeted, hitting the agricultural sector.
Very much so. And then they added more tariffs later, 5% to 25%, on another $60 billion of U.S. products.
So that soybean tariff, I imagine that caused some real pain for U.S. farmers.
Oh, absolutely. A huge impact. China was and is a massive market for U.S. soybeans. So losing that or having it drastically reduced was a big blow to those communities. It showed China was willing to apply pressure right back.
Okay, so we've got tariffs flying back and forth. Did it stop there or did things keep escalating?
Kept going. The U.S. raised tariffs again in May 2019, and then China took an even stronger step in August 2019. They essentially stopped buying U.S. agricultural goods altogether for a while. Soybeans, pork, the works.
A complete halt. That's serious.
Yeah, it signaled things were getting pretty frosty.
But then didn't things seem to maybe cool down a bit? There was that phase one deal, right?
Yes, exactly. Amidst all that tension, in December 2019, they hammered out the phase one trade deal.
What was the core of that deal?
The main commitment was from China. They pledged to buy a lot more U.S. stuff, an extra $200 billion worth of goods and services over the next 2 years, 2020 and 2021.
An extra $200 billion. So that sounds like a step towards de-escalation, at least on paper.
It was seen that way, yeah. A potential truce, or at least a pause in the fighting.
But then fast forward, the Biden administration comes in,
Yeah.
and most of those Trump-era tariffs, they stayed, didn't they?
They did, largely. That's a really key point. There might have been some expectation of a big policy shift, but President Biden kept most of the tariffs in place.
What do you think that was?
Well, it's complex. They did grant some specific product exclusions, tweaked things around the edges. But keeping the main tariffs suggests, ongoing U.S. concerns about the underlying issues, the IP theft, the subsidies, and maybe also seeing the tariffs as leverage, especially in the tech space.
Right, the tech competition didn't go away.
Far from it. We saw new actions like those 2022 export controls stopping advanced semiconductor tech going to China. That really highlighted the tech focus.
And things haven't exactly calmed down since, have they? Issues like Taiwan, chips, EVs.
No, tensions seem to be rising again, actually. 2023, 2024. There's been renewed talk, even threats of more tariffs, particularly around things like Chinese electric vehicles.
Okay, so this whole tax war has obviously sent ripples through the economy. Let's talk about the impact here in the U.S. first. What did it mean for, say, regular consumers, businesses?
Well, for consumers, the most direct hit was probably higher prices. Tariffs or taxes, right? And those costs often get passed down. So things like electronics, clothes, lots of imported goods got more expensive.
Yeah, I think people noticed that. And what about businesses? We talked about farmers.
Yeah, farmers, especially soybean growers, took a major hit from China's retaliatory tariffs, cutting off their main market. That was brutal for them.
And did the tariffs achieve that goal of bringing manufacturing jobs back? That was part of the argument, wasn't it?
That was a hope, yeah. But the results there seem, well, mixed at best. It's really hard to say definitively. Some jobs might have shifted, but there wasn't this huge manufacturing renaissance directly because of the tariffs. Other economic factors were also at play, of course.
So not quite the simple cause and effect maybe some expected.
The reality on the ground seems much more complicated than that based on the data we have.
Okay, now let's flip it. How did China's economy handle this? They were the target, after all.
China definitely felt it too. Their exports slowed down, particularly in those tech and manufacturing areas hit by U.S. tariffs. Their goods became more expensive for American buyers. Simple as that.
And did it change how companies operate, supply chains, and all that?
Oh yeah, big time. We saw a definite strategic shift. Companies started looking really hard at diversifying their supply chains, moving some production out of China to places like Vietnam, India, other Southeast Asian countries, trying to reduce that risk exposure.
So spreading the manufacturing base out a bit.
Exactly. And don't forget, China's own tariffs hurt U.S. companies operating inside China, too. If you were an American firm selling to the Chinese market, you got hit by those retaliatory measures.
Right, it cuts both ways. And this wasn't just a U.S.-China thing, was it? You mentioned global consequences.
Absolutely. This whole conflict added fuel to the fire of global supply chain disruptions, which, then got massively amplified by the pandemic.
A perfect storm, almost.
Kind of, yeah. And it definitely contributed to the inflationary pressures we've seen globally. Plus, it really pushed this idea of decoupling into the mainstream.
Decoupling. Explain that a bit more.
It's basically the idea of companies, and maybe even countries, trying to lessen their reliance on China, untangling those deep economic ties, especially in critical areas, and moving production elsewhere to reduce political or economic risk.
Okay, so trying to make supply chains less dependent on one place. So bringing it up to today, 2024, you're saying most of those original tariffs are still active.
Yes, the vast majority implemented under Trump are still in place under Biden.
And the tech focus is still strong.
Very strong. That tech war is ongoing. The U.S. restrictions on advanced chips are a key part of it. And China's responding too, like with limits on exporting rare earth minerals, which are crucial for, tons of high-tech stuff.
Rare earths, right. China dominates that market. And what about that phase 1 deal? Is there any talk of a phase 2?
Not really. Those talks have basically stalled out completely. There are still major disagreement subsidies. Taiwan is a huge sticking point. And then you had other things like the whole spy balloon incident, which didn't exactly help build trust.
Yeah, that didn't help relations. So phase 2 seems unlikely anytime soon.
Very unlikely, I'd say. The environment just isn't there right now.
Okay, so looking forward then, what might be next? More tariffs.
It's definitely possible. On the US side, you hear talk about potential new tariffs, especially targeting those Chinese EVs and batteries. That seems like a growing area of concern for US policymakers and industry.
Competition in green tech.
Exactly. And China could retaliate further too, maybe more export controls on critical materials like those rare earths we mentioned. They have leverage there.
So the economic pressure points are still there? And what about that bigger picture? Decoupling, you mentioned friendshoring.
Yeah, that seems to be the longer-term direction, less reliance on each other, especially in strategic sectors. Friendshoring is the U.S. push to get companies to move supply chains to countries that are considered allies or, friendly partners.
Building supply chains among allies.
Right. The idea is to make them more resilient, less vulnerable to geopolitical shocks involving adversaries.
So if you had to boil it all down, this whole U.S.-China tax war, what's the absolute key takeaway?
I think the main thing to grasp is that the tariffs, while important and impactful, are really just one part of a much bigger, more fundamental struggle. It's about who leads the global economy, who dominates future technologies. It's a long-term competition.
So the phase one deal was maybe just a temporary pause, not a resolution?
Exactly. It addressed some trade issues on the surface, but the deep-seated competition, the rivalry over technology and global influence, that's still very much alive and kicking. And it's likely to shape things for years to come.
It really does give you a lot to think about. It makes you wonder, will this whole decoupling push, this friendshoring, will it actually make economies more stable in the long run? Or just create new problems, new dependencies? It feels like the final chapter on this is far from written.
That's a great way to put it. The long-term consequences are still very much unfolding. And hey, if folks are interested, maybe next time we could dive deeper into how specific sectors got hit, semis, EVs, farming. There's a lot more detail we could unpack there.